Our next module within the nervous system will discuss the reflexes. So these are described as automatic, rapid, and involuntary responses to stimuli. They're considered automatic in that they can occur without conscious input from the central nervous system, but certain reflexes can be modified by conscious control. The events that occur during a particular reflex always happen in the exact same order every time. So for this reason, reflex events are quite predictable, and the neural pathway that controls a specific reflex is the exact same neural pathway that's activated every time that particular reflex happens. So the neural pathways that control reflexes are called reflex arcs, and they consist of 5 components. We have the receptor, the sensory neuron, the integration center, the motor neuron, and the effector. The receptor is the structure that detects the stimulus, and it begins a reflex. So in this example, the stimulus is a pin that has pierced the skin and causes nerve endings to send painful stimuli to the spinal cord and to the brain. The sensory neuron serves as the line of communication between the receptor and the central nervous system. The integration center is the part of the central nervous system that controls the particular reflex. So in this example, an interneuron in the spinal cord receives input from the sensory neuron of the skin, and then it decides how to appropriately respond to that particular stimulus. The motor neuron is the neuron that signals the body's response to the stimulus. The motor neurons are the same neurons that control our voluntary and involuntary muscles, but here they are used to carry out the body's response to that initial stimulus. The motor neurons communicate with effectors. So effectors are structures, like muscles or glands, that carry out the body's response and make a reflex occur. So reflexes are generally characterized by their effectors, so that is, which muscles or glands are activated as part of that reflex. Somatic reflexes are reflexes that have skeletal muscles as their effector, while autonomic reflexes have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands as their effectors. So let's look at some specific examples of reflexes and how they work. So we'll begin with the somatic reflexes. One type of somatic reflex is called a stretch reflex. These reflexes can occur in any skeletal muscle and help to maintain muscle at a constant length. So these reflexes help us to maintain balance and posture, and they generally tend to occur when muscles experience or are subjected to some type of undesired stretch, which is why they're called stretch reflexes. So the stretch reflexes begin when a skeletal muscle is stretched, so that is the initial stimulus that begins this reflex. Clinically, we can test stretch reflexes using what's called a reflex hammer. So in this example, one of the easiest stretch reflexes to test are these stretch reflexes of the quadriceps muscle group that are located on the anterior thigh. So if we have our patient sit at the edge of a chair or a table with their knee kind of roughly flexed in a 90-degree position, we can tap the patellar tendon, which is just distal to the tip of the patella. We can stretch this muscle out. We see that there are specialized sensory receptors in the muscle that are called muscle spindles, and muscle spindles serve to detect stretch, which causes a sensory neuron to fire. This sensory neuron, or the sensory nerve that it's part of, will extend all the way to the spinal cord, where it delivers its information directly to a motor neuron. These motor neurons have synapses with the quadriceps muscles, and when these motor neurons fire, they cause the quadriceps muscles to contract, and that contraction helps to resist the stretch stimulus. So if the patient, as I mentioned, is sitting on an exam table with their knee hanging over the edge of the table, we see the response of this reflex when the leg extends and kicks out. Again, any skeletal muscle is capable of producing a stretch reflex. It just so happens that this particular reflex at the patellar tendon is one of the easiest to demonstrate clinically or in the lab. We also see that the response occurs on the exact same side of the body as the stimulus, and therefore we would refer to this as an ipsilateral response because the prefix ipsi means same. So this is the same side of the body that the stimulus occurred on. Other somatic reflexes include the withdrawal reflex and the crossed extensor reflex, and we'll examine both of these now. So the withdrawal reflex is a response to a painful stimulus in a limb. We see that the sensory receptors in the skin will detect pain in the limbs and communicate that through sensory neurons to interneurons that are located within the spinal cord. These interneurons will then communicate with relevant flexing muscles in the limbs. So for example, in this particular diagram, the biceps brachii muscle in the arm, but it could also be in the leg as well. So these reflexes can also occur in the muscles of the leg. So in doing so, when they flex, they withdraw the arm or the leg from the painful stimulus. So the response in this reflex is also an ipsilateral response, because the purpose of this reflex is to withdraw the same limb that experienced the pain from the painful stimulus. Right? It wouldn't do any good if the contralateral or the opposite limb were withdrawn, because that was not the limb that experienced the painful stimulus. So therefore, it would not move that limb out of the painful or dangerous situation. The crossed extensor reflex is a reflex that typically accompanies a withdrawal reflex, particularly in the lower limbs. So for example, if we step on a painful stimulus and that triggers a withdrawal reflex in that particular limb, so in this example, this man has stepped on something painful in the water and a withdrawal reflex has occurred in his right lower limb. We see that in the contralateral limb, that is the limb that is opposite of the stimulus, the crossed extensor reflex is initiated. The same sensory neuron that triggered the withdrawal reflex will also trigger the crossed extensor reflex at the same time. And those sensory neurons involved in crossed extensor reflexes will communicate with many interneurons in the spinal cord and will activate many motor neurons that control extensor muscles in the contralateral limb. So those extensor muscles will contract and keep the leg straight to maintain balance during the withdrawal reflex. So the examples so far have been somatic reflexes, and these have all used skeletal muscles as their effectors. So let's briefly turn our attention to the autonomic reflexes, which have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands as their effectors. One example of an easy to demonstrate autonomic reflex is called the pupillary light reflex. So first we need a little introduction to the anatomy of the eye. The pupillary light reflex is a reflex of the eye. We see that the iris of the eye is the pigmented ring that's located at the anterior aspect of the eyeball. So not only does the iris contain pigment, but it also contains ring-shaped bands of smooth muscle. And those ring-shaped bands of smooth muscle help to determine the size of the pupil. And the pupil is the aperture in the middle of the iris that lets a certain amount of light into the eye. So this reflex, the pupillary light reflex, controls the size of the pupil that's in the center of the iris. Light that is too bright can damage our retina, which is the sensory structure that's located at the back of the eye. And so the pupil tends to constrict to let less light into the eyeball. In dim light, we see that the pupil will dilate, essentially to let as much light into the eyeball as possible. So the pupil will tend to constrict in situations where the ambient light is very bright in order to prevent damage to the retina. So reflex arcs control autonomic reflexes in just the same way that they control somatic reflexes. So the reflex arc for the pupillary light reflex is as follows. We see that there are sensory receptors located in the retina, which is the sensory portion of the eyeball. Those detect light levels, color, and things like that. Those sensory receptors that are in the retina will then communicate with sensory neurons in the optic nerve, which is cranial nerve number 2, and carry that sensory information to the brain. The brain then acts as the integration center for that stimulus. We see that the oculomotor nerve, which is cranial nerve number 3, will also carry motor commands to the smooth muscle of the iris. And since the effector of this reflex is the smooth muscle of the iris, we see that in bright light, the pupil will constrict, while in dim light, the pupil will be dilated. The response of the pupillary light reflex is what we call consensual. So that means that both sides of the body will respond equally, even when only one eye receives a stimulus.